They thought they were picking on an easy target, a quiet old man on a bus. What they didn't know, he was a battle-hardened Vietnam veteran with lessons they'd never forget. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets of Baltimore as the 5:15 bus rolled toward downtown. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scents of warm asphalt and the subdued hum of weary commuters. Among them, an elderly black man quietly settled into a seat near the front. His hands, weathered and strong, rested atop a wooden cane that seemed as aged and steadfast as its owner. He was dressed simply, in a worn but neatly pressed jacket and slacks. Everything about him suggested a man who valued dignity over extravagance. His posture was upright, his shoulders square, his eyes calm as they gazed out the window at the blur of the cityscape. Though his demeanor was unassuming, there was an intangible weight to his presence, like a man who had faced storms and emerged steady, yet the faint lines etched into his brow hinted at a life that had demanded more resilience than most. Toward the back of the bus, a group of 4 teenagers bounded up the steps, their laughter loud and unfiltered. They moved with the cocky swagger of youth, the kind that demands attention even when it isn't deserved. One of them, a wiry boy in a red hoodie, scanned the rows of passengers. His gaze landed on the old man, and his eyes lit up, not with respect, but with the mischievous spark of someone spotting an easy target. He nudged his friends, whispering something that made them snicker and glance in the same direction. The old man didn't react. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the window as if the boys weren't even there. But their whispers soon grew louder, the kind of forced laughter that demands to be noticed. "Hey, old man," the boy in the red hoodie called out, his voice cutting through the quiet like a jagged blade. "You forget your walker or something? Bet you're waiting for someone to carry you home." A ripple of discomfort passed through the bus. A few passengers glanced at the group, their expressions uneasy, but most avoided looking altogether. Heads turned back to books, newspapers and phones, their silence heavy with unspoken complicity. The elderly man's grip tightened ever so slightly around his cane. His face remained impassive, his eyes calm. He didn't answer. Red Hoodie grinned, emboldened by the lack of a response. He leaned forward, his tone mocking. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" The old man turned his head slowly, just enough to meet the boy's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just an impenetrable calm. For a moment the boy hesitated, the weight of that gaze throwing him off balance, but his pride wouldn't let him falter. The laughter from his friends filled the silence, but the tension in the air was thick. The old man's silence wasn't weakness, it was a choice that would soon make all the difference. The boy in the red hoodie straightened, shaking off the momentary unease caused by the old man's unwavering gaze. His smirk returned, though less sure this time. "What's the matter, old man? Too good to talk to us?" he jeered, his voice louder now, as though volume could mask the slight tremor creeping into his tone. His friends chuckled, though their laughter had lost some of its confidence. The old man shifted in his seat, his cane now held firmly between his knees. He didn't speak, didn't react, but his eyes stayed locked on the boy. It wasn't a glare, there was no anger in it, but the calm, piercing stare seemed to strip away the bravado layer by layer. The boy's friends nudged him, urging him on, their amusement at his performance mixing with a hint of nervous energy. The other passengers remained silent, their discomfort palpable, as they pretended not to see the tension unfolding. "Bet he's just ignoring us, 'cause he can't do anything," another boy chimed in, the one with a backward cap. His tone was lighter, almost testing the waters, as if gauging how far they could push without crossing an invisible line. Still, the old man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his grip on the cane relaxing but never releasing. His silence wasn't the silence of someone defeated. It was deliberate, purposeful, like the stillness before a storm. His gaze remained steady, unflinching, and it unnerved the boy in the hoodie more than he cared to admit. "Come on, say something," Red Hoodie demanded, his voice tinged with frustration. "You think you're better than us? Sitting there all quiet like you're the king of this bus or something?" The bus jolted over a pothole, making the boy stumble slightly. A few passengers glanced up, but still no one intervened. The air on the bus felt heavier now, the kind of tension that makes even the hum of the engine seem too loud. Across the aisle, a young woman with earbuds in her lap shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between the boys and the old man. She looked like she wanted to speak up, but didn't. Red Hoodie's bravado wavered. He leaned in closer, his movements less confident, as if unsure whether to back down or double down. "You think you're tough," he spat, though his voice cracked slightly. "Bet you've never fought a day in your life." At this, the old man's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He straightened in his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Strength isn't in your fists," he said, the weight of his words pulling the air from the room. "And it's not in how loud you can be. It's in knowing when to act and when to stay still." The boy blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The passengers around them held their breath, the stillness on the bus so complete it felt like time had paused. But Red Hoodie wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His pride demanded a response. "Oh yeah, why don't you show us then?" he said, stepping closer. The old man sighed, his fingers brushing the worn wood of his cane. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, years ago, in a place far removed from this Baltimore bus. A storm was brewing, and he knew exactly how to handle it. The old man slowly shifted his weight forward, his cane steadying him as he stood. The motion was deliberate, calm, and yet carried an unspoken authority that seemed to fill the space around him. The bus lurched slightly as it continued its route, but his balance remained unshaken. All eyes turned toward him now, some curious, others apprehensive. Even Red Hoodie took a step back, his bravado faltering as the man straightened to his full height. He wasn't a tall man, nor was he physically imposing, but there was a gravity to his presence that silenced the whispers and stifled the smirks. "You want me to show you something?" the old man said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to press on the air. "All right, let me show you." The boy's cocky grin slipped further, but he crossed his arms in defiance. "Yeah? What do you got, old man?" he challenged, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. The old man tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on the boy. "Do you know what this cane is?" he asked, his tone quiet yet unyielding. He tapped it lightly against the floor of the bus, the sound sharp and clear against the heavy silence. The boy shrugged, feigning disinterest. "A stick to keep you from falling over?" he muttered, eliciting a weak chuckle from one of his friends. But even the others seemed less sure of themselves now. The man's lips curved into a faint smile, not of amusement, but of knowing. He raised the cane slightly, holding it for the boy to see. The wood was smooth, polished with years of use, and a small brass emblem near the handle glinted in the dim light. "This," he said, "isn't just a cane. It's a reminder. Every nick, every scratch tells a story. Stories of places you've never been, stories of things you wouldn't believe." The boy scoffed, though his gaze lingered on the emblem longer than he intended. "What, like some old war stories? Is this the part where you tell us about how tough you used to be?" The man's expression didn't change. "You think toughness is about how much noise you can make?" he asked, his voice steady. "You've got no idea what it means to be tough. Toughness isn't in showing off. It's in what you endure, what you carry with you. And most of all, it's in what you can walk away from." The boy's friends shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier confidence evaporating. One of them muttered something under his breath, glancing toward the front of the bus, as if considering an escape. But the old man wasn't done. "Let me tell you something, son," he continued, his gaze never leaving Red Hoodie. "When I was your age, I thought the world owed me something too. I thought being loud and reckless made me strong. Then I found myself in a place where none of that mattered, where the only thing that kept you alive was discipline and respect. And I watched men, good men, pay the price for not understanding that." The boy opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The weight of the man's voice, the stories it carried, seemed to sink into his chest. For the first time, he looked uncertain, his bravado cracking like a brittle shell. "You don't need to make the same mistakes," the old man said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "But if you're too proud to listen, life will teach you the hard way." The bus jolted to a stop, and the silence inside felt heavier than ever. The old man straightened his jacket, his eyes still on the boy. "Now, are you going to sit down, or do I need to teach you right here?" The boy hesitated, his defiance wavering as the old man's words hung heavy in the air. Red Hoodie glanced at his friends for support, but their earlier smirks had disappeared, replaced by uneasy silence. The tension on the bus was palpable, the kind that made even the hum of the engine feel louder than usual. Passengers leaned forward slightly, their gazes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. It was as though they were witnessing something they couldn't turn away from, a moment charged with both vulnerability and truth. The old man's eyes softened, but only slightly. His grip on the cane remained firm, not as a threat, but as an anchor. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. The boy blinked, caught off guard. "Why do you care?" he muttered, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Because every name has a story," he said. "And every story shapes the person you are and the person you're going to be. So tell me, what's your name?" There was a pause, and for a moment it seemed the boy might refuse to answer. But something in the man's steady gaze made him falter. "It's Jordan," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Jordan," the man repeated, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "Let me tell you something about names, Jordan. My name is Thomas, but to some I was Corporal Thomas. To others, I was a brother, a friend, a protector, and to a few I was just another face they never got to see again. Names carry the weight of everything you've done, good and bad." Jordan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. The bravado that had fueled him moments earlier was now a distant memory. His friends were silent, their earlier energy now replaced by an unspoken realization that this was no longer a game. Thomas leaned on his cane slightly, his posture steady but relaxed. "You think this is about pride," he continued. "Pride won't keep you standing when the world tries to knock you down. Pride won't teach you how to respect yourself or others. And pride sure as hell won't bring you peace when it's all said and done." Jordan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, but he didn't respond. It was clear he was struggling, not with anger, but with the uncomfortable sting of being seen, truly seen, for who he was and who he pretended to be. The bus hit another bump, jostling the passengers slightly. Across the aisle, the young woman who had been staring at her phone earlier now looked directly at Thomas, her expression a mix of awe and gratitude. Others exchanged glances, their silence speaking volumes. It wasn't just Jordan who was learning something here. Everyone on the bus seemed caught in the gravity of the moment. Thomas straightened, his gaze unwavering. "You've got a choice, Jordan," he said. "You can keep pretending the world owes you something, or you can stand up, take responsibility, and earn the respect you're so desperate for. But let me tell you this, respect isn't given to the loudest voice in the room. It's earned through actions, through how you treat others, and how you carry yourself when no one's watching." Jordan's eyes flickered with something unspoken, regret perhaps, or a glimmer of understanding. He looked down, his hands unclenching slowly as he sank back into his seat without another word. His friends followed suit, their earlier bravado completely extinguished. Thomas exhaled quietly, lowering himself back into his seat with the same deliberate care as when he had risen. The tension in the bus began to ease, but the weight of his words lingered, heavy and undeniable. The lesson wasn't just for Jordan, it was for everyone. As Jordan sank into his seat, the bus seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had gripped everyone just moments ago began to lift, but the weight of what had been said lingered in the silence. Thomas remained seated, his cane resting lightly between his knees, his face calm and unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't bask in the uneasy quiet he'd created. Instead, he stared out the window, his mind somewhere far away, as if the confrontation had cost him something invisible but significant. Across the aisle, the young woman finally broke the silence. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Her words weren't directed at Jordan or his friends, but at Thomas. He glanced at her, offering the faintest nod of acknowledgement. Her gratitude wasn't just for his bravery, but for speaking what so many of them had felt, yet hadn't dared to voice. Behind her, an older man in a suit folded his newspaper slowly, his movements deliberate. He cleared his throat and spoke, his tone laced with reflection. "It's rare these days," he began, addressing no one in particular, "to see someone stand up with such conviction. Most of us," he hesitated, gesturing vaguely toward the passengers, "just stay quiet and hope things blow over." Thomas turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on the man. "Silence," he said, his voice steady, "is a choice. But sometimes it's the wrong one." His words weren't accusatory, but carried a gravity that made the man nod slowly, his expression thoughtful. In the back, the young man with the headphones slung around his neck leaned forward. "Sir," he began hesitantly, "what made you, why speak up like that? Most people would have just ignored them." Thomas considered the question, his fingers tracing the worn grooves of his cane. "Because ignoring it doesn't make it stop," he said after a moment. "I've seen what happens when people stay silent. I've seen it destroy lives, destroy communities. Words have power, and so does action. You can't always fight fire with fire, but you sure as hell can't put it out by pretending it's not there." The boy nodded, his respect evident in the way he sat a little straighter, as if absorbing every word. Nearby, Jordan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward Thomas, before looking away again. His friends whispered among themselves, their earlier bravado replaced with a subdued energy. It was clear the lesson had sunk in, even if pride kept them from admitting it aloud. The bus slowed as it approached the next stop. Thomas glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. The vehicle came to a halt with a gentle hiss, and a few passengers stood to exit, throwing quiet glances of admiration his way as they passed. The middle-aged woman near the front hesitated before stepping off, turning back to look at Thomas one last time. "We need more people like you," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "Thank you." Thomas nodded again, offering a faint smile. He didn't need recognition, didn't seek validation for what he'd done. For him, it was enough to know that maybe, just maybe, the seeds of change had been planted, not just in Jordan, but in everyone who had witnessed the moment. As the bus doors closed and it pulled back onto the road, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations that had once been idle or non-existent now carried a tone of reflection. Thomas leaned back in his seat, his cane resting against his leg. The battle wasn't over, he knew that. But for now, he had done what needed to be done. The bus hummed softly as it rolled through the evening streets, the tension replaced by a quiet reflection that seemed to ripple through its passengers. Thomas sat still, his hands resting lightly on the cane he had wielded as much as a symbol as a support. His calm demeanor, unchanged since the confrontation, carried an unspoken message. Strength isn't loud or flashy, it's steady, deliberate, and unshakable. In the back, Jordan's shoulders sagged, his bravado deflated. He stared blankly at the window, the fleeting city lights doing little to distract him from the weight of what had just happened. The words Thomas had spoken echoed in his mind, louder now that the laughter of his friends had faded. Jordan's fists, once clenched in defiance, rested loosely on his knees. He didn't look at his friends, and they didn't look at him. The reality of their actions hung heavy between them, and for the first time, silence became their shared language. A few seats ahead, the young woman who had thanked Thomas earlier leaned over to the older man in the suit. "Do you think he's okay?" she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Jordan. The man adjusted his tie, his face contemplative. "He'll be fine." The bus slowed again, the brakes hissing softly as it approached another stop. This time, no one stood to leave. Instead, the passengers exchanged subtle glances, unspoken acknowledgements passing between strangers who had all shared the same extraordinary moment. The older man folded his newspaper and placed it on his lap, his hands resting over it like he was holding on to something fragile. "We're so quick to judge," he murmured to no one in particular. "That man, he's carrying more than we can see." Thomas, though seemingly lost in his own thoughts, heard the comment. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting the man's. "We all carry something," he said softly, the words landing like a stone in still water. The passengers nearby nodded in quiet agreement, the weight of his statement resonating with their own private burdens. In the back, Jordan shifted uncomfortably, his friends muttering something under their breaths. After a pause, Jordan stood, hesitated, then slowly made his way down the aisle. The passengers watched as he stopped beside Thomas, his voice low and uncertain. "Sir," he began, his usual swagger replaced with sincerity, I'm sorry for what I said, for disrespecting you." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting Jordan's without judgment. "Apology accepted," he said simply, his tone firm but kind. "But remember, respect isn't just words, it's how you carry yourself, how you treat others, especially when no one's watching." Jordan nodded, his expression earnest. "Yes, sir," he said, before returning to his seat, his movements slower, his head slightly bowed. The bus carried on, and as it moved through the city, the lesson Thomas had imparted seemed to linger in the air. It wasn't just Jordan who had been changed, it was everyone. And though the world outside carried on as it always had, inside that bus, a quiet transformation had taken place. As the bus glided through the city streets, the hum of the engine filled the spaces where tension once lingered. The passengers sat in contemplative silence, their gazes shifting between Thomas and Jordan. The old man's calm had seeped into the air, leaving behind a sense of weight, of lessons unspoken but deeply felt. Thomas shifted in his seat, adjusting his cane and leaning back slightly, his posture no less composed than before. His eyes wandered to the window, catching glimpses of the world outside, a city teeming with life, its people moving in endless rhythm, unaware of the small but profound moment unfolding inside the bus. His thoughts lingered on the boy, Jordan, and the apology that, while tentative, carried the seeds of something greater. He had seen this before, young men grappling with their own missteps, unsure of how to make things right but brave enough to try. At the back of the bus, Jordan sat quietly, his usual bravado replaced with an unfamiliar stillness. His friends avoided his gaze, their earlier camaraderie now replaced with awkward silence. Jordan's mind raced, replaying Thomas's words over and over. Respect isn't just words, it's how you carry yourself, how you treat others. The phrase felt like a weight he couldn't shrug off, pressing against the cracks in his tough exterior. A few rows ahead, the young man with headphones glanced at Thomas again, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Sir," he said tentatively, his voice breaking the silence, "what branch were you in?" Thomas turned slightly, his expression softening. "Army," he replied simply, "1st Infantry Division, Vietnam." The young man nodded, his admiration evident. "My uncle was in the Marines during Vietnam. He didn't talk about it much, but I think he carried a lot from those years." Thomas gave a small nod, his gaze distant but focused. "We all carry something," he said. "Some of us speak about it, some don't, but it shapes us all the same." The conversation seemed to breathe new life into the bus, passengers leaning in just slightly, as if eager to absorb the wisdom Thomas offered so freely. Even Jordan, though silent, listened intently, his eyes fixed on the old man as if searching for something. Answers, perhaps, or understanding. The bus began to slow again, the brakes hissing softly as it approached another stop. Thomas glanced at the street signs and tapped his cane lightly against the floor. "This is me," he announced, rising to his feet with the same measured calm that had defined every movement he'd made. As he made his way to the door, a middle-aged woman near the front spoke up, her voice tentative but warm. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Thomas paused, turning to meet her gaze. His expression softened into the faintest smile. "We all have a part to play," he said. "Sometimes it's as simple as reminding each other of what really matters." Jordan stood abruptly, his movements uncertain but determined. "Wait," he called out, stepping into the aisle. Thomas turned to face him, his expression unreadable but patient. "I don't think I'll forget what you said," Jordan stammered, his voice low but earnest. "And? I'll try to do better. I promise." Thomas studied the boy for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. "The real test is what you do when no one's watching. Remember that." Jordan nodded, his shoulders straightening just slightly, as if the weight of Thomas's words had settled into something he could carry. Thomas stepped off the bus, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. The door closed behind him, and the bus pulled away, its passengers watching as he disappeared into the crowd. The hum of the engine filled the silence once more, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavier, richer, filled with the echoes of a moment that had left its mark on everyone. As the bus continued its route, the young woman with the phone glanced at Jordan, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know," she said softly, "he's right. Respect doesn't cost anything, but it means everything." Jordan looked at her, his usual cocky retorts nowhere to be found. Instead, he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it does." The passengers settled back into their seats, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as an ordinary bus ride had become something more, a reminder of the power of quiet strength and the ripple effect of a single act of dignity. Each person on that bus carried the lesson in their own way, the old man's words weaving into their thoughts like threads in a larger tapestry. For Jordan, it was a wake-up call. For the passengers, it was a moment to reflect on their own actions, or inactions. And for Thomas, it was simply another day, a chance to leave the world just a little better than he'd found it. Because sometimes, the strongest people aren't the loudest. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the quietest moments. And sometimes, it takes an old man with a cane to remind us all of what truly matters. The story of Thomas and Jordan reminds us that respect and understanding are timeless values, often overlooked in today's fast-paced, digitally driven world. In our daily lives, it's easy to judge others based on appearances or assumptions, just as Jordan and his friends did. However, the quiet strength of someone like Thomas teaches us the importance of looking deeper, to recognize the experiences, struggles, and wisdom that every person carries. In life today, we can apply these lessons by practicing empathy and mindfulness in our interactions. Before reacting or making judgments, pause to consider the other person's perspective. Whether it's a coworker, a stranger on the street, or a family member, showing respect costs nothing but can have a profound impact on someone's day, and even on your own character. Furthermore, stand up against disrespect when you witness it. Like Thomas, you don't need to confront with anger. Calm and firm actions can leave a lasting impression and inspire change. Respect isn't just a value, it's a skill we can nurture every day. By embodying patience, kindness, and quiet strength, we contribute to a more understanding and compassionate world, one interaction at a time.